What would you do if the one thing everyone told you to give up on turned out to be worth more than your entire life savings? Eleanor Brooks was 68 years old, alone, and standing in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of her late husband's coffee, holding a letter worth $2,400,000 for 18 acres of land that, 4 years earlier, her own neighbors had called worthless. Not worth much. Worthless, the kind of land people politely tell you to walk away from before it embarrasses you further. She didn't smile when she read the number. She didn't cry either. She just folded the letter, set it down next to her husband's old reading glasses, and walked outside to think while an entire town waited to see if she'd finally do the sensible thing. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why a dumpster full of garbage nobody else wanted became the reason a corporation was willing to pay millions for dirt everyone else had already buried. And I promise you, the way she answers them is not what you're expecting. If stories about people who refuse to quit when everyone tells them to hit different for you, stay with me, because this is one of the good ones. And if you want more real stories like this, hit subscribe before we start, because you don't want to miss what's coming next on this channel. 4 years earlier, Thomas Brooks worked those 18 acres for 40 years, right up until the Tuesday morning his heart gave out with the coffee still warm on the table. He didn't get to finish it. Eleanor found him at the kitchen table, exactly where he'd sat every morning of their marriage, and the silence that followed was the kind that doesn't leave a house, it just moves into a different room. She buried him on a Thursday. By Monday, 3 neighbors had already stopped by, casseroles in hand, to tell her, gently but firmly, that it was time to sell. It's too much land for one person, they said. The soil's been going bad for years. Everybody knows it, Eleanor. Nobody would blame you. They meant it kindly. And they weren't wrong about the soil. Years of heavy rain had leached the nutrients clean out of it, leaving fields that produced thinner, sadder harvests no matter what you planted, no matter how hard you worked them. Local farmers had a name for ground like hers, tired ground. Eleanor listened to every word. She thanked each of them at her door. And then, alone that night, she did something none of them expected. She walked out to the fields in the dark, the way she used to walk beside Thomas after supper, and she decided she wasn't selling. Not the fields, not the house, not the 40 years he'd put into ground that most people had already written off as dead. She had no formal training, just half-remembered lessons she'd picked up standing beside her husband, about crop rotation and soil health she never thought she'd need to use alone. She had almost no savings. She had a tractor that started on the 3rd try if she was lucky, and 18 acres that everyone in town had quietly buried right alongside Thomas. What she didn't have, that first week, was any idea how she was actually going to save it. That answer was 3 miles down the road, in a place she'd driven past 1,000 times without ever really seeing it. And it was about to change everything, though it would take Eleanor almost 2 brutal years to believe that herself. The dumpster no one wanted, Harlow's Point Fish Market, opens before sunrise. At 4:30 one morning, unable to sleep, Eleanor drove past it and saw something she'd never noticed in 1,000 trips before. Workers hauling wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of oyster, clam, and mussel shells into industrial dumpsters. Tons of it, bound for a landfill. What happens to all that, she asked. Hauled off twice a week, the dock manager shrugged. Costs us a small fortune, actually. Eleanor looked at the mountain of shell, pale and glinting under the dock lights. Most people saw garbage. She remembered something Thomas once mentioned that generations ago. Farmers worked crushed shell into failing soil, long before anyone called it a soil amendment. I'll take it, she said. All of it, if you'll let me. He laughed, not unkindly confused more than anything. Free hauling meant one less expense for him. He told her to bring a truck. Eleanor had no idea yet that this decision would nearly bankrupt her, turn her into the subject of town gossip, and take 2 brutal years to prove right. What followed were 2 years nobody believed her. The research came first nights at the library, then at her kitchen table, digging through old agricultural bulletins. Crushed shell, properly aged, releases calcium carbonate slowly into soil, correcting acidity and rebuilding the conditions life needs to survive underground. The science was sound. The execution nearly broke her. She had no crusher, no capital, no equipment, just a repurposed wood chipper, a mallet, and stubbornness. Her first batches, still carrying residue from the market, rotted in the sun with a smell sharp enough that her nearest neighbor complained within the week. "People are starting to talk," he told her. They did talk. Some said grief had taken her mind. Others joked, less kindly, that she'd turned her family farm into the town dump. At the diner, the old-timers started a pool on how many months before the county shut her down. Then it got worse. Her tractor died for good, the repair bill more than she had. A week of relentless rain washed half her carefully built shell pile straight down the hillside, undoing a month of labor in a single night. Standing in the mud the next morning, Eleanor allowed herself for the first time to wonder if she'd taken on more than she could finish. That same week, a land buyer knocked on her door with an offer. He was polite about it, even kind, which somehow made it worse. "No shame in it," he told her, glancing past her at the ruined test field. "Land like this takes younger hands than most people have left at your age." Eleanor told him she needed time to think. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the offer in front of her and Thomas's chair empty across from her, and for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry not for the soil, not for the money, but for how tired she was of everyone assuming she'd already lost. She thought about how easy it would be to say yes, to stop smelling like rotting shellfish, to stop being the woman the whole town whispered about at the diner. She didn't sleep much that night. But somewhere around 4 in the morning, lying awake, she thought about the earthworms she hadn't found yet. The ones the books promised would come back if the soil healed. She realized she hadn't actually failed. She'd just run out of time before the proof arrived. She wasn't sure yet what she'd tell the buyer. But something in her still wasn't ready to let go. But the ground was hiding something. Winter passed slow and quiet. When the ground softened again in spring, Eleanor walked back out to the half-acre test plot that had cost her so much, and the soil wasn't the same soil anymore. Where it had been pale and lifeless, it was now dark, loose, crumbling easily between her fingers. She knelt and turned over a handful. Earthworms, several of them, moving through ground that hadn't supported life in years. She planted that section quietly: tomatoes, squash, a modest row of greens, and said nothing to anyone. By midsummer, the difference was impossible to hide. Her vegetables grew larger, deeper green, sturdier than anything else on the property. It was the same neighbor who'd complained about the smell who noticed first, standing at the fence line comparing his struggling tomatoes to hers. "Eleanor," he said, "what did you do to this dirt?" She told him plainly. He didn't believe her until he tried a sack himself. 3 weeks later, he came back asking to buy more. That's how it always spreads in a small town. One conversation, over a fence, at the feed store, after church, a local gardener, a retired teacher, then a small organic farm, 2 towns over, placing an order 5 times larger than anything Eleanor had ever sold. One woman with a wood chipper and a mallet could not keep up, and she was about to find out that success brings a different kind of pressure entirely. Turning the waste into a business, Eleanor went back to the fish market and 2 more markets besides and proposed something formal. She'd take their shell waste on a standing schedule, for free, solving a disposal cost that had quietly drained their budgets for years. They agreed without hesitation. Then, she hired help. 3 people who'd been out of steady work since the local cannery cut its shifts 2 years earlier. She trained them herself, batch by batch, the same way she'd learned through failure. She named the company Brookside Organic Soil. After the farm, after Thomas, after land nearly everyone had left for dead, fish markets saved real money. 3 families had steady income again. Waste that once went straight to a landfill was rebuilding struggling farms up and down the coast. And the 18 acres that had been dismissed as tired ground had become the proof that convinced everyone else it could be done. But the biggest test of everything Eleanor built wasn't going to come from a rainstorm or a broken tractor. It was going to come with a signature on a check for $2. $4 million. The offer word moves fast in a small town. By the time the corporate buyout letter arrived, most people already assumed there was only one sensible answer. A representative came to see her in person a few days later, sharp suit, softer voice than she expected. A leather folder he set carefully on her kitchen table like it might bruise. He walked her through the numbers slowly, the way people do when they assume you won't understand them the first time, retirement, security. No more early mornings, no more aching hands. You've already made your point, Mrs. Brooks, he said. There's no shame in taking the win. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, out the kitchen window, toward the half-acre test plot where she'd once knelt in the mud and wondered if she'd ruined everything. That's the second time this week someone's told me there's no shame in quitting, she said quietly. I never said there was. He didn't have an answer for that. He left the folder on the table and told her to take her time. You'd be a fool not to take it, one neighbor told her, meaning it kindly. You proved your point. Nobody thinks you're wasting your time anymore. Take the money. Eleanor sat with the offer for several days. Each morning she walked the same fields, past the original half-acre test plot, now indistinguishable from the healthiest soil on the farm. She thought about Thomas, about the fishermen who no longer paid to dump their shells, about the 5 employees who'd found steady work when they needed it most. Then she turned it down. It stunned almost everyone in town except the people who'd actually watched her, season after season, refuse to give up on ground everyone else had already buried. When asked why, Eleanor gave one answer, and she meant every word of it. My goal was never the money. It was proving that something everyone else threw away could still be useful if somebody was patient enough to see it through. Instead of selling, she restructured Brookside Organic Soil into a cooperative, giving the fishermen who supplied her shells and the farmers who depended on her product a permanent stake in what they'd all built together. Its success, going forward, wasn't hers alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who helped save it. Where she stands now years later, Brookside Organic Soil is a respected regional supplier, generating 6-figure profits every year while keeping thousands of pounds of shell waste out of landfills. It employs 12 people. Farmers up and down the coast, once fighting the same tired soil Eleanor once had, now work it back to life with a product that started in a rejected dumpster in a half-acre test plot behind a farmhouse nobody thought would survive. Eleanor's hair is silver now. Her hands are slower. But most mornings, before sunrise, she still walks those same 18 acres the way she did with Thomas. And the way she did alone in the years everyone told her to quit. She kneels down, turns over a handful of dark, crumbling earth thick with earthworms, and remembers a dumpster full of shells nobody else wanted. Everyone else saw garbage. Eleanor saw the future waiting the whole time for someone patient enough to notice it.